Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And ahead of our Spies and Resistance Week, which starts tomorrow, although it's a bit sporadic, the shows is 2 on one day and a couple of days with no shows, but that's starting tomorrow. We got a kind of one of those one-offs that we do every now and then. And Neil Storey, who my guest is today, has been a friend of mine. We've just worked it out, at least 30 years. It could well be 35 years. So it's really delightful bringing someone on who I've known so long. So without further ado, I'll bring Neil. He makes my little pathetic little beard thing look really, really, really awful. But anyway, Neil R. Storey, good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Good to see you. Yeah, I'm very, very well. I'm all relaxed, so forgive the hirsute stubbliness, but
That's fine. Were you out speaking last night? Well, I was just going to introduce you there. You travel the world. You do military history, social history, true crime history. You kind of step into the paranormal investigations. There's not much you haven't done with your how many dozen books you've written now. What is it? 50 something now? 60
something books out there. Which it began with sort of local history. But then over the years, I've been really lucky to be able to write about the things that move me and interest me. But we both knew each other in the PM time, pre-moustache.
Pre-moustache time, no, indeed. And I had hair then as well, and you still have.
Man.
But
well,
anyway,
I thought you were still had a mop of hair and boyish.
No, I wish. So the subject today, Blackout Murders. I think a lot of us watching of our age group and up, we have this image of wartime Britain from the Giles cartoons, the George Formby films, the media like that, of everybody's doors being open, it being a wonderful time. Everybody, obviously the war aside and the bombing aside, but wonderful time in sense of togetherness and spirit and everybody pulling in the same direction. But as you're going to explain to us, it actually was a chapter where some of the most darkest, grimmest murders and crimes happened. So paint a picture of what the cities and the countryside was like in those war years and in the blackout era for us.
What's really intriguing is that people often forget that with, as you say quite rightly, the sort of jangling pianos, the chirpy cockneys, and the carry-on spirit that was, it's easy to say, oh, it didn't really exist. Well, it did. You had to have a spirit to get through the bombing, the blitz, the fear. Because not every night that an air raid warning siren sounded was there an air raid. But you didn't know. We can all look back and say, well, there was nothing for months there, but the sirens were still going off. People were hitting the bed, they'd hear the siren going after a while, and they didn't get out of bed because they were so tired. They didn't want to go down the garden into an Anderson shelter or have a rotten night in a public shelter or a rotten night in the underground. People just had enough. But I'll add to that, it was the 1st of September, 1939, the day that evacuation took place. That was the first night of the full blackout. There'd been practice blackouts through the summer. And the real concern, and it was from sort of shop owners, chambers of trade, was that, okay, we understand that there's going to be blackouts, but this is going to provide a cover for a host of burglaries, break-ins, street robberies. Chief constables were echoing this too, that it was a real concern. And then on top of that, you've got a problem where lots of policemen were ex-military. And if they'd left the army, Navy or Air Force and joined the police, they would be on the reserve. So if war came along, they'd be called up. They had to go. The police couldn't hang on to them. They would be back in the armed forces. So you suddenly lost a great swathe of experienced police officers. Police officers went to volunteer. And so you're having to recruit at quite high speed, war reserve constabulary. You've got to recruit special constables, and you've got to get more people on the force. And so you lost that great swathe of experience. And the door is open, Paul, that for those that thought, shall I have a go at crime? This is, if there's ever going to be a golden moment, I'm going to go for it now.
And that's weird to talk about a crime spree, which is what we're going to be talking about as a golden moment. But that is the opportunist. That is that there's people who see a war coming as a way of making money. They see people who are making it, increasing their social standing. Look at the various spies and things. And you've written about spies as well, whose motivation isn't necessarily country. It's about making money. They want power. They want to get influence. They want to rise their social standing. That it's an ego trip. It's about becoming a more important person. And as we know, and you've done a lot of work on the kind of motivations behind serial killers and criminals. It's not just about the physical thing of stealing or the physical act of murder. It's about power. It's about control. So when you research these stories, you research them and all, you've done a lot of, you're a ripologist, you've done Jack the Ripper stuff, you're still doing that, you're breaking news stuff about that subject all the time. Is there a similarity between wartime London and the kind of Victorian London that we have this image from the Jack the Ripper era, or are they too disparate to compare?
That's a really good point. And I must admit, I hadn't thought an awful lot about that. But if we think, how have things changed? Well, you've still got an awful lot of gas lamps in London.
Yeah.
Now, a gas lamp, well, if you go down to your kitchen at night and you just open the fridge door, and the amount of light you get from that bulb at the back of your fridge across the kitchen floor, that's about the same power as a gas lamp. And often they were really more of a way to, you'd follow from pool of light to pool of light to get home. So when you get to the 20s and 30s, you've got this advent of neon signs, lit signage, lit windows. And those that remembered the age of gaslight were from that older generation, a generation really that had passed. So when we get out of the First World War, they had got used to brighter lights. They'd got used to displays, electricity, street lamps. Then for suddenly it to be plunged into absolute darkness. And in 1939, it really was, if you're on the street and you light a fag, just with a match, strike a match, you can get fined for that. If you haven't bound your torch up enough to cut down the light, you can get fined for that. And in fact, on the streets of Great Britain in 1939, there was an unprecedented number of road traffic accidents on the streets, because people cannot see the obstacles. Obstacles, maybe they've walked past them 100 times in the past, but they're just not registering. They're disorientated, and there are many, many fatalities. It was literally, stay off the roads, keep death off the roads, So
it's weird, isn't it? We talk so much on this channel about the increasing technology of World War II. We've done ASDIC, we've done radar, we've done aviation, torpedoes, the whole lot there. And as you're saying there, the quality of policing is inevitably dropping a little bit because of the pressures, and those that are left who are good are doing a lot more work because there's bombed out buildings, there's refugees, there's everything else, and as you say, the special constabularies have gone off to war. The streets are in darkness, so that you've got used to having to be able to navigate and see where you're going, and that so you're plunging back into an era of the past. Factories are at full pelt, so there's maybe even more smoke than normal because we're trying to produce tanks and guns and stuff like that. So in this environment are where some of these people emerge. So what you're going to do for us today is you're going to take us through some of these murderers. And of course, folks, there are lots more stories in the book, and the links to the book are in the description below. You can find that down there. And once you've started on one of Neil's books, you'll move on to the other ones, and the other ones you can go back into local history, Norfolk, Suffolk, true crime, Jack the Ripper, the whole lot there. We will do questions as we go along today, folks, because that's what we're going to do. So we'll put it on our first slide, and Neil can tell us about this person here. Some of you may be familiar with this story, Gordon Cummins. So over to you, Neil. Tell us about this particularly despicable human being.
Well, it's beyond anything people could really have expected in wartime. The early wartime murders, before a single bomb fell on London, before France had fallen, you had a number of instances of crime where there were shops being broken into, people raiding pubs, wannabe gangster youngsters as well. Then all of a sudden, once we get through 1940, the bombing, the Blitz on London, we get into 41. There are attacks on ports. on industrial cities. So London is in this strange situation where it's got international servicemen coming over, late 41, 42. The intensity of bombing, of course, it's changed. You've got a war-shattered city, but you've also got a city that's starting to come back to life. The West End is particularly vibrant, but because you've got all these different troops in our nation's capital, you've got people seeking entertainment. They want to find some fun, and there was a mentality in wartime where it's kind of live for today, because tomorrow you could be dead. Amid that atmosphere, that people became quite carefree. London, we've got to use the term that prostitution did increase, because that's where the business is. You had what became known as camp followers, so there were problems wherever military camps sprung up with any degree of permanency. There was, and there were, prostitutes and prostitution. In the capital, it's party time. It's live for the day.
Yeah.
And amid all of that, in 1942, and we talk about these kind of 4 or 5 women that they're fairly sure Cummins killed. It's over a spree period in 1942, but when you look before that, and most serial killers don't start straight away with the serial. They will build up, sometimes beginning by attacking animals. It can, maybe stabbing somebody, a woman, in the dark, strangle attack in the dark, but building up. And when you look at attacks around London at that time, there are some near where Cummins was based in his RAF. It was a training centre where he was in training. A lot of people don't realise his father was in charge of boys' homes, and father and mother. He came from a stable and loving family. They're not far away. They're in a London suburb. Cummins is also married. He's a married man, and his wife loves him. They communicate. It's very strange that his wife talks of him as a perfectly normal man. There doesn't seem to be any evidence whatsoever of a sexual dysfunction. And to be honest, Paul, if we think of this man that we're seeing here, I've shown this picture. I like to speak to my students, to friends that don't know the cases. And maybe I've got a few wartime portrait photographs, and I'll show them, among them, this man. They don't know crime history. And I've got to be honest, some of the ladies actually say, well, he's rather attractive. They say he's a handsome man. And they are drawn to his eyes. They don't know the story. They just know this person as quite a handsome looking fellow. And the point is, if you had encountered this man in a dark street, if he's cool, he's calm, he's collected, maybe he's charming. This is a dangerous predatorial killer. But what seems to happen, and it is rather bizarre, is that he will engage a woman. The first killing we know could be his first manifestation as the serial killer. The woman is found; she's been sexually assaulted down in an air raid shelter, a public air raid shelter. Her clothes have been damaged; they've been interfered with, and he has a proclivity for inserting things into the vagina of women, and also strangling and cutting. The wounds to this woman are not extensive, but it does seem that something has been inserted into her, and it's terrible. But what happens is, rather like the Jack the Ripper killings, each one escalates in its horror. And rather like the Jack the Ripper killings, that when Jack attacked on the street, there was a great, the horror got worse and worse, but his worst attacks were actually when it was the worst one of all, the Mary Kelly killing in November 1888, was the only one inside. A killer of this nature, if they are able to have the domain of this woman, they are able to have privacy to attack and kill really in their own time, so to speak. It's terrifying because it's early days for forensics in many ways during the Second World War. There were some great developments further forward, but they believed that Cummins would strangle these women, and then he would go. Well, the evidence is certainly supporting. He's not tooled up. He's not carrying a knife. He's not carrying a hammer. He's not carrying any sort of offensive weapon. What he does, he looks around the flat, and he will normally go into the kitchen. He will find knives, and he will find things to assault these women's bodies quite horrifically. And the evidence is the medical evidence seems to support that they were not dead. They'd been strangled to a degree of unconsciousness where they could respond to the pain that this man inflicted. It's absolutely horrific. But my son is actually involved in mental health, and you'll remember little Lawrence, won't you?
Yeah, not so little now.
28 odd years old.
Oh God. He's still 5 or 6 in my. Don't spoil it, Neil.
Well, he's rather like a handsome version of me, and he's a very clever young man. But he's worked an awful lot in mental health now, and in his early days, he was more hands-on with patients, and he's never named, but you do discuss things that happen with no names, no details. But what did manifest, and my son has seen this, was what they call the 0 to 60. And this is a very strange thing, that you could have a very normal looking person, just like you, me, the next person. And you'll be talking to them, and without warning, they go from 0 to 60 and their strength becomes superhuman. It will take 3 people to respectfully restrain somebody. I've got a feeling, and there's very little mental assessment of Cummins. His mental assessment that was presented to the court that's extant in his file is one side of A4. I've got a feeling that he went out with the intention of maybe, who knows what his intention was, but the degree of the injuries that he inflicted and what he did, I think he was one of these sort of 0 to 60 manifestations, a very, very dangerous predatorial killer.
I mean, and we could do more about the gravity of the crime. We're not going to, but to bring it back to the subject of World War II TV, one of the things that's such a fine line is public morale, the feeling of a country. And we've talked about the positivity of things like the Dam Busters raid, or for the Americans, the Doolittle raid, in increasing morale, which increases production, which makes everybody feel good. And although those things don't actually win wars, they help people believe they can win wars. And one of the things, learning about these is this kind of thing happening in an environment where you're living affects the morale of everybody living there, because strangers can come and go in wartime. The streets are full of strangers. They're full of different accents. They're full of people with uniforms you don't recognize. And the connection for this is, I wonder how much kind of productivity went down around this, because the streets are not safe. People are now anxious. They're not sleeping. The police are anxious. Everyone's and that's not even including the poor victims themselves. It's the collateral damage. I'm thinking is you can't measure that. With the benefit of 80 plus years of hindsight, it's hard to measure what kind of impact this had, but it must have had an effect on people.
What is intriguing is how little appeared in the press.
Right.
And this is over a condensed period of time of killing. It was a spree killing of little more than a week, really. And the country wasn't walking in fear. There's next to no coverage in the press at that time. That you'll hear the phrase, "There's a war on." People wanted to read the war news. This was way down the scale. The murder of some of the most vulnerable women in all society is not playing big in a press that, we have to admit, is heavily controlled by Ministry of Information and Morale, you know. So when he was caught, and it was quite rapidly that he was caught. It was all thanks to one of the women he attacked outside. His gas mask either slipped off or he put it down. It came down with a thunk. She knew it was there, picked it up, and inside the gas mask was his service number.
Service number, yeah.
It gave him away. And she went to the police station, and they soon tracked him down to his RAF base. They actually found typical old trick that the men were signing in and out for each other, and he was seen to be cleaning his uniform and taking the soles off his boots, off his shoes, so it wouldn't give away, if you left any tracks behind. But there's thumbprints, there's all sorts of clues that brought Cummins to justice.
Well, we're glad he was. And we've got a couple of questions from Sean Brennan, a regular viewer. I'm just going to put the second one up. He's saying these murders may have been assisted by the blackouts, but not necessarily triggered by war. Would these crimes probably have happened without the war? I mean, the thing about the war is, because there's killing going on all over the place every day, does that affect the psychopath who makes it, because it seems more normal now? Everyone's out there killing. It's normal for a fighter pilot to walk into a pub and say, I've just shot down 2 Jerrys today, so you're a killer. So maybe the psychopath feels it's more normal to do that. Is that something, do you think?
It can all be part of it. If you're part of a society where thousands of lives are lost day in, day out, yes, it's a complete change from the norm. It's rather like this situation, and it's an odd way of thinking about things, but it pays to do it sometimes. If Myra Hindley, by modern standard, a more modern case, had never met Ian Brady, would she have ever been a killer in her own right?
Yeah. Well, the ingredients
these were the 2 ingredients that sparked one of the most heinous and horrible series of crimes in the history of Great Britain. But that's after the war, we know that. But it's the chemicals, that in the it's all the things in the mix. So yes, it doesn't necessarily mean that wartime triggered these, but Blackout Murders is very much about how criminals could turn. Some crimes are very much because it's dark, they're going to commit them.
Opportunist,
Opportunist. And also the live for tomorrow. It's that fatal mix. And I can assure you that there are instances of murder around the country that we'll see. There was one particularly awful one in Newcastle. Young wife, newlywed. Her husband, this was the first time since they'd married that they'd had any time together. She'd said goodbye to him at the station. He said, "Are you going to get a cab back?" She said, "No, I want to walk." Clear her head. And on her walk home, she was horribly, it was a sexual attack, and she was horribly attacked. Thank God they caught the man within a little more than 48 hours.
I mean, that's a testimony to how good the police were, despite the loss of people to the service. But another photo, we'll move on. Another photo, and this could be one of those 1930s theatre sort of daybill kind of supporting artiste kind of photo, isn't it? This is
Ronald Coleman style, isn't it?
Yeah, really? But another rather infamous killer. I'll let you tell us about him.
This is Johnny Haig. He was quite a very amiable and dapper sort of chap. A little bit of a loner at school, but he had a penchant for hanging out with attractive ladies, fast cars, and he had a gambling habit. And he wanted to have the lifestyle of a bit of a gentleman, not a playboy, because he didn't play a lot of women, but he wanted that kind of gentlemanly je ne sais quoi about him, always wearing gloves, always being very dapper in his appearance, always making sure, got more than an inch of cuff sticking out from his well-tailored suits, always clean shaven, always presentable. He's had a lifetime, really, where he's into conning people. He's a Mr. Get Rich Quick. He'll convince you, and some people will be extremely well convinced by him. They'll believe in him. They will trust him. Gets to wartime, and it is. He's in prison at the start of the war. He's actually in Lincoln prison for fraud, all the old sort of con man typical stuff. Nothing too serious, but while he's there, they're working with acid in one of the workshops there, and talking to some of the people in prison with him, he sort of they do deals inside, and he gets a little bottle of this acid, and he gets a mouse, dead mouse, puts it into a glass or some sort of container, and just puts the acid on top, and the mouse can actually be dissolved. And this got Haig, he'd been thinking about this for a while. He tried it out, and he thought, well, if there's no body, then you can't prove it, can you? And the other prisoners thought he was a bit strange. He gets very cocky about it. He thinks he knows the law and all this kind of thing. And it's during the war that he's released. He catches up with his old friend Mac McSwan, and he's a nice young man. But he looks as dapper as Haig. He's got a series of cafes that are kind of pinball. Do you know the early pinball games? They're very popular. And he's got a number of arcades, and he wants a bit of a manager. So the two of them kind of hook up together, two dapper chaps. In reality, McSwan is a young man who's living in an environment where there are pimps. There are, at the time, homosexual is illegal. It's thought that he was homosexual, involved in some very shady deals as well, knew some shady people. And he said to Johnny Haig, I really don't want to serve in this war. I think I'm going to need to disappear. And Johnny Haig says, I think I can help you with that. And so they meet up. And this is over in Kensington. And Haig has said he's going to do war work. Now, you have to remember, and many of your viewers will know, that war work could take on many different forms. And if you are developing things for the war effort, that could be a very small part for an engine, lorry, aircraft, tank, armored fighting vehicle. So Haig is developing something small in a little basement under Gloucester Road, under a shop. The basement, by the way, has quite a nice drain underneath with a good flow of water. It's got a front entrance that you go down steps from on the street side, and at the back at the Mews, they've got a back door there as well. So Haig said, look, to his friend, Mac, come and have a look at my workshop. Let me show you what I'm up to. A few days before, he'd got in touch with one of these companies that supplied acid. He'd also borrowed from the local ARP that was a water butt. Can we borrow that? Oh, yeah, take that away. We're not having too much trouble at the minute. Gets the iron water butt down into the cellars. Then he's got to try and work out how do you get these huge carboys of acid into the tubs eventually. And he got the orders because he's on war work. And you can't say too much. It's all top secret, you see. It's patriotic not to say. Ask too many questions. All tap the nose, nudge, nudge. War work. Matt goes down, and it's thought it's either a lead pipe or something similar. Kosh on the back of the head. Matt goes down dead, and Haig puts him into the metal oil drum container, in effect. This metal water butt. Gets the acid on top of Mac and dissolves him. But the thing is, Haig hadn't really thought that when you come to dissolve a human being, the amount of vapors that come off a dissolving human are extremely noxious. And thanks to the wartime conditions, he was able to leave his upper back door open from the workshop so he could rush out the back and gasp in the fresh air. Otherwise, he'd been overcome by fumes down below. And then, of course, as time went on, more and more people fell. Both the McSwan, Mac's parents ended up down in the Gloucester Road cellar in two butts of metal oil drums, and they were dissolved. And he would carry on after World War II when he got a workshop out in Crawley. And that's when you'll get the famous image of him. He'd actually killed a doctor who had served in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he had nicked his revolver and his gas mask. And that's what you'll see, the iconic Haig with the gas mask on and the rubber gloves and the revolver for killing. That was all stuff he nicked post-war. During the war, he tried to fabricate some sort of pad over his face and get by under the cover of the blackout. But it all began during the darkness of World War II.
And it is fascinating. I'm just thinking about these, we used to go to them ourselves up in Sheringham, the World War II railway events. And there's that huge nostalgia for World War II. We see it, and I like that myself. But it's, again, the war wasn't rosy. I mean, we obviously, we know there's death occurring on the front lines and in the Blitz and the Holocaust. But the fact that these things are happening in the streets as well, and they're happening possibly more as well, is just, we need to be reminded of it, that the people who look at World War II as rosy, the nostalgic for the past. It's not. Some of it was all right, but some of it was very, very nasty. But another infamous killer, Reg Christie. So let's again, some people will know the story already, but interesting that we've got him in the police reserve uniform there.
Yes, I mean, this is absolutely classic. As a killer that begins in World War II, we can see that he's attacked at least one woman severely and done time for that before the Second World War. He's done time in prison for fraud. When we get to World War II, with everything is carried out in a hasty way, Reg Christie is incredibly able to join the Metropolitan Police War Reserve. I mean, they're just they should be checking. And I'm sure he's not the only person that had a criminal record. I mean, this guy's done time for serious assault and fraud. Anyway, he's done his time. But what's interesting, that Haig Christie could never resist that little bit more fibbing. If you look on his chest, he's wearing First World War ribbons, and he was in right at the end of World War One. But he's actually wearing a 1914-15 star ribbon, in addition to a British War Medal and a Victory. So even then,
he just kept it up a bit. Yeah,
couldn't resist lying. But he had this photograph taken because he didn't get on very well with his family. But he was very proud to be in the War Reserve, and he took his job very, very seriously. They're in this grotty little street, very, very down at heel, called Rillington Place. And they used to call him Himmler, because he was such a martinet about lighting restrictions and maintaining the blackout and maintaining law and order. He was absolutely...
And that's worth just picking up on it, because we talked about this power thing, because in war, if you're going to achieve victory, you need discipline. You need everybody to... It becomes a more authoritarian society, because it has to get, everybody has to, but like not that I'm comparing it to COVID, but we had to all buy into the restrictions and the lockdowns and the mask requirements, because you feel this needs to pull together in that direction. So anybody who gets a little bit of power, there's more inclination during a wartime setting for these people to you need to follow them. You need, in peacetime, you might say to a copper, fuck off, but in wartime, there's this danger of, if there's an unexploded bomb down the street or something. So these figures have a little bit more power than normal. Absolutely, which must add to the whole thing of where they then spiral out of control and become who they become.
Oh, that and there are yet more murders. You see, this is mid-war when we're seeing him come to the fore as a known killer, but there are killings in 1939, particularly 1940, where it could be an early Christie killing. It really could, but we can't prove it. And you've got to remember that underneath the rubble of the Blitz, you could hide a multitude of sins. And if you've got a police uniform on, you've got as a War Reserve policeman, you've got access to police intelligence.
Yep.
Christie was very much one for consorting with prostitutes, women of disrepute, and for turning a blind eye to what they were up to. He could get all sorts of favors out of them too. But also, if you think his first victim, Ruth First, that we know of, that her story is utterly tragic. That she's come out of Germany, Austria. She's fled for her life, like so many youngsters did, and she couldn't find her place easily. Her life is absolutely fractured, and he encounters this woman at her lowest ebb in a cafe, and he persuades her that as a War Reserve police constable, he's trustworthy. It may be she needed money. It may be that she went back to Rillington Place and some sexual act passed between the two of them for money. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that she was going back to see the man, and one day he killed her.
Yeah. But we say we don't know what other crimes had happened before then. That's
right.
Going off on a tangent. When people talk about the civilian bombing casualties in Normandy, every mayor after the war submitted their report saying, yes, this farm was hit, that building was hit, so we lost the Levises and the Leclercs and so and so. But what they can never allow for is the transient people who are moving through. There are refugees, there are people hiding, there are people under fake names hiding from the service provider obligataire front. So the same things applying all across the cities of England, is it, and Great Britain wider. People are moving through. Police have access to reports. There's bombs going down. There's streets being cordoned off. There's the blackout. There's how many people who are listed as victims of the bombing were maybe actually victims of something worse, or not
That's right.
worse, but a crime before being killed. It's a fascinating area for study, but I can imagine there's not very much to find, because as I say, you can conject, you can speculate that there are other crimes before the ones, but you can't prove anything.
You can't. But you see, he was able to kill women and then take them into the garden under blackout, and he was burying them in the corner of the garden. He had 2 women in this garden that we know of by the end of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And in fact, by the time we got to the end of the war, he was ranking around in the garden, and he'd taken out some of the bones that emerged, and he was using a bone to prop open the gate. He'd taken one of the skulls and dumped that at a bomb site. It's just off the scale. But when after the war years, of course, he doesn't have the cover of darkness, and that's when he starts hiding the bodies in the house. So if there are 3 bodies. His wife, he kills her. She's underneath the floorboards. And then there was this alcove in the kitchen where he puts the bodies of, there were 3 prostitutes or women that he managed to inveigle back to his home. People who trusted him, a work colleague that trusted him. They're in this cupboard that's just papered over. And when he finally, I think he probably just flipped out and he couldn't afford to carry on. And he took to the streets. Maybe he thought he'd become like a vagabond, and in the end, he's recognised by one of the London bridges and brought in, and he was exposed as one of the most appalling serial killers that we've ever heard of in the British Isles.
No, I mean, and again, folks, I remind you that there's lots more information in the book. We're going through a brief version of these, but another figure. Again, it's kind of given away in the Blitz Butcher. But tell us about Mr. Dobkin. No, not Mr. The Mr. applies. I'm going to have some respect for him. Tell us about Harry Dobkin.
Harry Dobkin got married at a fairly young age to Rachel Dobkin, and she got pregnant. It was said almost like on the wedding night. He didn't want that life. He ended up. It was an arranged marriage. It was something he really didn't want. He and she, quite rightly, had to have support for their child, and he didn't want to pay. He and she kept on pestering. He owed a lot of money, and one day he said, "Oh yes, well let's patch it up. Let's meet up." It's during the Second World War. They're seen meeting in a cafe together. By that time, the child has pretty much grown up, but he's never paid any serious amounts of alimony. He needs to support this woman. Can't easily work anymore. She's got a medical condition. Doesn't make working easy. She's spending living with her sister a lot of the time. Time to give this woman a break. Get a new start. But he kills her, and rather than bury it, if he'd taken a lead bar to her head, thunk, and put it in the rubble of the Blitz, which was still around, he might well have got away with it. Quite easy, particularly if the body had become decomposed. But what he did was, he'd seen that he was a fire watcher, a night watchman. In the building where he watched, he'd seen there'd been some building work carried out, and they'd left some builder's lime. Now, that's not the same sort of lime that can destroy a body quickly. In fact, it's the sort of thing that will cause a little bit of corrosion, but it will stop the bugs getting to it. And so it means that bodies are often preserved when they're put near builder's lime. And he kills Rachel, he dismembers her, and hides her under the slab in the wreckage of a chapel covered in this lime. Now, if it had been the corrosive lime, severely corrosive, it might have dissolved, or it might have gone without trace. But when men were clearing this away to start getting London back to shape, they lift this stone and they find that this body cannot have been blown apart by a bomb. A bomb blasted body does not have bones that have been sawn through quite accurately. It also doesn't, it's not daubed up with this builder's lime that proved quite a good way of preserving it. And Keith Simpson, and he was one of the one of the men that really did take forensic medicine beyond the days of Spilsbury. Keith Simpson meticulously examined the body, and he saw that the hyoid bone, which is in the throat, it often gets broken under cases of strangulation, only under manual strangulation, and it was broken. And then they took the skull that they'd found, tried to identify who this body is. Now, remember, this is before DNA. And at one of the major London hospitals, they worked with a female technician there, and she said, yeah, well, what about if we x-ray the skull? I mean, they got a photograph of one of the missing women, Rachel Dobkin. She's known to be missing. They'd spoken to the sister, who had been persistent, saying, look, my sister's missing. Something's happened to her. I suspect the husband's done something awful. Turned up the photograph, superimposed the skull and the photograph together, and there it is. Some people will know this picture. It's quite an iconic picture from murder books, but I think the story still stands up, but it's worth retelling. That, as I say, if he just lumped on ahead with an iron bar, he would have probably got away with it.
Yeah,
but
we won't leave that image there for too long because it's not very nice. But it's interesting that you say that it does aid with the investigation of crimes. Techniques, I guess, are coming out of this, but which is I suppose
thanks to Wartime.
Yeah, we'll move on. A couple more slides to go. And folks, I know it's been a bit kind of distressing stories, but to me, the reason, as good as as Neil is as a storyteller, it's also the idea we're getting about wartime Britain. Anything that helps us understand that wartime Britain was not the jolly place that, say, the Giles cartoons say it was. I mean, there was, as Neil said, there was some joy there. People were living for the moment, but it's not the only part of the story. And I think it's important to understand that their crime was rife, and we haven't even touched on organized crime and the selling of and the fuel and all that. Again, we have the image from Dad's Army,
Walker, don't we?
Yeah, Walker being essentially a good guy who's just getting people an extra bottle of whiskey, but that was a real problem. There were things were being stolen from military camps and bases. There was things, penicillin was a massive wreck problem in Italy, wasn't it, in the later part of the war? Absolutely. Organized ranks. So that's another thing we can talk about in the future. But anyway, back to the Blackout Murders. Elizabeth Jones, please, Mr. Storey, sir.
She's gorgeous, isn't she?
Yeah,
pretty young girl. And she is a Welsh Jones as well. And growing up in the quiet little village that she did, she thought, I shall have my adventure. And she went to London, where she wanted to be an exotic dancer. And I think she probably was for a while. But like in any actress can find, the work doesn't always come in. Maybe she wasn't that great a dancer, but she becomes a waitress, and she's pretty good at that. She's very personable, people like her. And while she is waitressing, she meets a handsome, apparently brave American officer. He said his name was Ricky. His real name was Carl Holton. And these two in some ways, it was the same as, I mean, they weren't attacking children, but it's like that horrible Brady Hindley scenario where a couple get together that maybe would have never entered into a murder spree, but they did. He had actually deserted from his unit, and he told Betty, this is Carl Holton, he looks like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth.
Yeah, he looks got kind of like puppy fat, kind of like he's not very old and a bit
Yeah,
innocent.
yeah.
And yeah.
There's even a hint of the sort of young Elvis look to him.
Yeah.
You know, but he gets together with Betty and he tells her, "Oh yes, I used to run with the gangsters. Oh yeah, he's a real Chicago Joe, you know. Oh, I've always wanted to be in that life. Wow, you know." So he's got a big lorry that he's nicked from his army base, and they go between London and Reading on these runs. And first instance, there's this poor woman going along on a bicycle. He parks the lorry up. He gets out of the lorry, and as she draws past the lorry, bang, knocks her down. Oh, that's fantastic. How exciting, you know. And then it advances to serious assaults. And Elizabeth Jones, at times, she's holding the women down that he's thacking. She's helping remove the bodies. One poor woman they thought they had killed, and they carried her to the river. Unfortunately, they threw her in the river, and it brought her to, and she survived, and she was one of the prosecution witnesses. But these two, you look at them, can you believe it? And then what brought this all to a head is that Holton, they're around the Hammersmith area, and they they get a taxi, and they rob taxi drivers. That's an easy touch, isn't it? And he's got this Browning automatic or similar, and they're going round a bend. He's told the taxi driver, right, pull over here. And as he kind of goes around the bends, so Holton says, the thing goes off and shoots the taxi driver. The taxi driver had a cleft chin, and he was seen as quite a rugged sort of fella. And his face appeared in a number of the newspapers, so it became known as the cleft chin murder. But once they resolved that Holton and Jones had gone off in the taxi driver's car, it wasn't that difficult to track down a car that's parked not far from Hammersmith, parked on one of the streets. The coppers are going around with the numbers, and they tracked him down. Betty Jones was very lucky to escape the gallows. She was complicit in all of this. She found it extremely exciting, but she served a life sentence. She survived it as well. She came out on good behaviour, etc. But Holton, he went to the gallows. And if some of you might remember the film Chicago Joe and the Showgirl, starring Kiefer Sutherland, it's based on the story of these two.
And it's again the details that I find fascinating are the relative ease within the war. It was to fob yourself off as someone else, because he claimed to be this Ricky guy. He claimed to was a there was a story that it was the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, American. Yeah. So normal, and how in that again, it's about this situation. You're in the war, whether you're a civilian or you're a worker, you're a policeman, you're a railway worker. You want to be part of the effort. You want to be part of the war effort. And so when someone tells you there's something, you are generally much more trusting in the wartime environment, because you all consciously have this idea of pulling in the same direction. And so therefore people like Carl and Elizabeth, who are not nice people, who have been, in her case, she suddenly becomes a bad person, where again, if she hadn't met him, would she have gone down this? That's the fascinating route there. But they are able to take advantage of this innocence and wanting to believe people are telling the truth that the wartime situation brings about. That's what I find really fascinating.
I think it is, and I think that it's a strange medicine, a horrible brew that changed this woman into an accomplice and a close accomplice to murder. But they clearly didn't think of it as murder. It was almost like they were enacting something that they'd seen on an Edward G. Robinson or a James Cagney film. It was unreal to them. George Orwell even wrote about this phenomena of modern murder. Is this what the world has come to under the wartime conditions? I guess.
No, and it's this whole situation of this heightened sense of mortality, because later in the war, a V2 can take out a street in a split second. An aircraft can go down and kill your husband, kill your brother, kill your son, and so this living for the moment, where most people are using that as a positive way of enjoying the extra dances, enjoying the radio shows, the going to, as you say, theater is booming, cinema is booming, but other people are using it as an excuse to go out and be shitty people, basically.
Unfortunately so.
Yeah, so we've done all the murderers that we're going to cover tonight, but just to kind of finish off there, we did have a few questions about the organized crime, and we just touched on Walker and Dad's Army there. Is that another aspect that you've studied or have written about or are interested in?
I've always been interested in the home front and telling the truth of the stories on the home front. So the book that precedes this one is called Faces of the Home Front. And this is where I did call on some of the interviews that I've been interviewing Second World War veterans since the late 1980s. And it all began really because the grandparents that I spent so much time with when I was a young lad, I just knew that their generation was passing, and their generation, that they all said, oh, we just did our bit. These were stories that were going to go with them, and they were stories that needed to be recorded. So we called the book Faces of the Home Front because it's not just the portraits, and we found quite a lot of the colour images from World War II. Some people would say, well, they reenactors. No, I said, there was colour photography in wartime, very good it was too. And we want to look at, if you think of the faces of a mountain, some faces are easier to deal with than others, and that's really what inspired a book just about the murders. But we wanted to tell, as the World War II generation tragically it is sad. You remember, Woody? Come on, this is no brag. They were our mates.
They were our mates, weren't they? Yeah, and we were reverent for them, and not in the same way that the last few are being treated now. There wasn't this hushed voices, oh my God, it's a veteran. It was just, you listen to their words of wisdom, but in a way that you would a mate telling you something they knew about. You'd hang off their words, but not in that same way. When I see the veterans come to Normandy, the very few that come down now, and people they burst into tears just seeing a veteran. Well, we didn't do that, did we? Well, I don't think I ever did, but we
had a drink with them, and that was the joy.
Yeah, that was
we
the
knew
thing.
them
So,
in their when these are often the men who were younger at the end of World War II, so they were in their 60s, they were in their 70s when we were knowing them, so you could have a drink with them, and particularly if they didn't have their ladies with them, the stories that they'd tell you
would get a little bit bluer, yeah, a bit more honest, yeah. And
if we're really honest about it, you soon saw that these guys are still teenagers. They've just been around a lot longer, you know?
Yeah, they're just as Alex Scott, our mutual friend, says, men don't age. They get to 12, then it becomes 12-1, 12-2, 12-3, and you remain 12 for the rest of your life if you're a man.
Dear old Alex, he's not wrong.
But one of the things I want to bring about before we bring things to an end is that, I mentioned at the beginning, you're a military historian, social historian, cultural historian, crime historian. You say you dabble in the paranormal history as well. And you speak to school groups, you do TV work, you do some of our military guests, some of our guests in World War II are very brilliant, but they're very narrow. They're from the academic world, or they write military books for people who like them. You meet people from all walks of life and of all ages. So why is it important to give those people an all warts a vision of the past? You mustn't just sugarcoat it and say dark stuff didn't happen. I mean, people would say, oh, well, it's all crime, it's sensationalist, but you would say it's important to understand the past was everything. Is that right?
Absolutely right. If you still had careers written in passports, mine would say I'm a social historian. That's what I do, and I specialize in the impact of war on British society in the first half of the 20th century. That's what I do. And particularly looking at the impact of war on communities, on individuals, on the way that it shaped our modern world. So if we just have one narrative, which is a constant positive narrative, and it's certainly not the narrative that the veterans told me. There was one story, the passing story that they would tell to their family and kids. You sit down, you have a drink, and they'd say, but tell you what, boy, there was a wrong and this used to happen. You talk to women who were young women during wartime and some of the things that they experienced and before the war. It's not just attitudes to gender, but there were sexual crimes that nowadays make your hair curl that were taking place then. Why do we talk about it? It's human life, and and I think it makes the story even more powerful if we understand all of this is going on. But still, out of all of that, yes, they'll talk about the myth of Blitz spirit, but it wasn't a myth entirely. It did exist against all the odds. People carried on. They looked after their neighbors. They looked after their friends. And there were even laws passed that if you spoke, disparagingly about the war effort, you could end up in court. You could be fined. So you can't be a miserable git all the war. Do your bit.
Yeah. And I think that you made the really good point there, Neil, is that we mustn't look at any of this with a blanket interpretation, because, I get very defensive when people say, oh, all the greatest generation, they were all heroes. Yes, the great majority of them were.
Yes,
but some of them are murderers. Some of them are cowards. Some of them deserted and left their friends. As you said there, some of the veterans I said, yeah, there were wrong-uns in our unit. There were people you wouldn't bring back to meet your mum. You wouldn't leave your girlfriend alone with them, and you wouldn't let them look after your dog when you go. Because the military, millions of people served in World War II, and most of those millions did their bit, did their effort, and we should thank them. But not all of them. These blanket, like as we had when we had Paul Johnson about the Brookwood, on the memorial there. Yes, the great majority of people on that monument are air crews who were shot down, and but some of them were murderers, and that's the point. Any kind of blanket statement is effectively wrong. If you say the war years were just positively full of nostalgia, that's wrong. Saying they were tragic and is also wrong. There's nuance, and as a social historian, that's the thing. It's that nuance that the war. Serving through the war, living through the war, gave you mixed experiences. There were bits you'd look back on fondly and bits that would give you maybe nightmares for the rest of your life. And it's that nuance I want to get into on this channel, and it's that nuance that you're very good at writing about.
Thank you so much. But it is true. You've got to tell this story in the round. And I think if you consider the story of the people of Great Britain, this is from my point of view, I don't know about every soldier in every part of the world, but my God, what a job they did to get through that. But tell the story in the round that war doesn't just affect the soldier on the front line, it's people at home as well. Yeah. And some of those people went through a hell of a war.
I'm going to leave it with this comment from Sean Brennan there. If the greatest generation is only known as heroic caricatures, then their achievements are impossible to live to try up in our flawed present. So it's if we put them on too much of a pedestal, we're in danger of losing what it is they were doing, and they were ordinary people, men and women, children who were part of the war effort. They weren't superheroes. They were struggling with fear. They were struggling with the self-doubt. They weren't always going through every day waking up thinking we're going to win this war. That's one of the things that when veterans say, there were times when we thought we were doomed. We were doomed, Mr. Mannering. Yeah. This idea that Churchill said, yes, we're going to win this. But he probably woke up on some mornings thinking, oh, my God, we're never going to get through this.
Absolutely right.
And that's important.
It's how you stick your chin out.
Keep on going. So, Neil, I'm not going to leave it there's long before I invite you back again. You've written about spies in England. You've written about other things. Just when you've got another spare moment or another book out and you want to come back and have another chat, we'd be delighted to have you back. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us today. And have you enjoyed talking to our little group of travelers?
It has been a pleasure, and thank you all for your questions and comments. And buddy, it's always good to see you.
Yeah, and you. Cheers then, Neil, and thanks everybody for watching. I will see you for Spies and Resistance Week starting tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Thanks. Bye.